What's up, lore masters? So today's video will be an analysis of the episode Far Beyond the Stars. It will break down the events, morals, and implications of the story itself. These are things relevant to the day and age, so if you feel that it will make this channel too political for you, please feel free to watch something else. A YouTube video on how to click out of this one, or one on how to exit out of your browser, will be provided in the description below. With that out of the way, let's just get into it. Before I go too far, I'm going to admit a couple of things about this episode. It is incredibly ham-fisted. It doesn't jive with the overall story arc of Deep Space Nine. Things in the episode don't cohesively fit with themselves, and it randomly comes out of nowhere. There's very little to justify why Sisko's visions occur, and only a thin veneer tying it all to Trek. That said, the message itself is well constructed, and the story, if you remove the Star Trek skin on the edges, is exceptional. As I literally just said, the episode itself has very little to do with Star Trek, Deep Space Nine, and the Dominion War. The bits involving the Deep Space Nine crew are stuck together with glue and tape at best. The beginning of the episode shows us Benjamin Sisko, who has learned that he lost another friend on the Cardassian border. A captain whose ship was patrolling and got ambushed. He's a victim of the normal hit-and-run tactics that we've seen throughout the war. Benjamin states that nothing ever really seems to change or go right for him, that for every win he accomplishes, an equally or more devastating loss occurs. Basically, he's describing what life is like for those in the 20th century. While all of this is occurring, he begins to receive visions again. The reason for this is given lip service, but not really expanded upon. The same effects of what we saw in the DS9 episode Rapture is occurring here. Unlike Rapture, though, this episode is not foreshadowing anything. It's just a one-off random. For those who don't remember the episode, Rapture was basically a warning for Bajor to not join the Federation. This would be due to the Dominion taking over Bajoran territory in the future. This episode, Far Beyond the Stars, doesn't have any future connections with other episodes, though there may have been a plan for it to tie everything together. This is a little known fact, but it's true that Ira Steven Behr wanted the entirety of Deep Space Nine to just be a television show produced by Benny Russell in-universe. Thankfully, Berman overrode him, because if Deep Space Nine had been a TV series in-universe, that would have meant that both TNG and Voyager, at a minimum, were the same, given that there were crossover episodes. It boggles my mind that Ira still defends that ending to this day. Anyway, let's get to the basic episode. It's a plot revolving around racism, mostly, and sexism somewhat. For the purposes of this review, I'll be referring to the characters as we generally know them, not as their doppelgangers. That's just to make it easier and less confusing. I'll try to note the characters' names within the story, but then refer to them as, again, what we know them as. So, Sisko is beginning to have hallucinations that he is a part of a world set in the 1950s to 1960s. His name in these hallucinations is Benny Russell. He is a writer along with a woman, two white men of English descent, and an Irishman. I break it down this way to give perhaps the one misstep of the episode. And honestly, for what they were trying to go for, this is a bit of a nitpick, but I think it's still worth looking at. But before I do that, let me clarify. I would never make the argument that African Americans haven't endured a large amount of racism. In fact, it's my opinion that we are still seeing the effects of hundreds of years of slavery. You don't just get over that. Indeed, one of the very reasons I'm doing this specific breakdown is because I think we need to have these conversations in almost every realm where we can when it's applicable. That said, in the times portrayed, the 50s and 60s, Irishmen were actually oppressed as well. Again, not to the extent of African Americans, but it still occurred. The portrayal of O'Brien as being on par with Bashir and Quark is unrealistic. Interestingly, a large part of anti-Irish sentiment would be brought over from Europe, and it would be very prevalent. In fact, shops would put up signs in the 1950s and 1960s that would say things akin to "no blacks, no Irish, and no dogs." It is likely that O'Brien's character should have received a lot more racism than he did in this episode. To once again clarify, this doesn't take away from the episode or its message. The focus on how African Americans were treated in the 50s and 60s is laudable, and the history of race relations for the US is abominable. It is a good message, but it wouldn't be the lore reloaded if I didn't look at it from every angle. Anyway, Sisko, O'Brien, Bashir, Quark, and Kira are all writers for a science fiction magazine. Interestingly, Odo is their boss. When I first watched the episode, I wanted to really analyze the choice of placing Odo here. Could this be an allegory for the real Odo in the Trek universe? In the actual universe, Odo was a gatekeeper, trying to keep both sides happy during the occupation. Odo did what the Cardassians asked, so it may make some sense that he would kowtow and follow the orders of the racists in this universe. But he would also try to help and work with the writers to give them what they wanted. He didn't want the world to be the way that it was. He just went along with what was happening. It's an interesting discussion. But with the exception of Gul Dukat and Weyoun, I see little thought or allegory put into any of the other choices for the rest of the crew, so maybe this is just giving it too much credit. While deciding on what stories the writers would try to construct for the next month, Odo advises that the owner, Mr. Stone, wants to have a picture of everyone to show what the writers look like to their audience. Of course, both Kira and Sisko will need to sleep in that day because they won't be in the picture. Ironically, O'Brien would probably be asked to sleep in late too, but we've already discussed that. And I think it's worth noting that we see this scene, yet in Star Trek there was a writer named DC Fontana who chose that name as a pseudonym so she could hide her sex in the writing credits due to discrimination. But behind the scenes aside, the fact that Sisko and Kira won't be there does start a fight. Odo states that literature that involved Negro people, their words not mine, was a discussion for liberals and intellectuals. First, is Trek trying to tell us that liberals aren't intellectual and only smart conservatives push for equality? I mean, I'm just saying. Bad faith arguments from me aside, this dialogue generally upsets some people. I do think there is truth to it though. Liberals and progressives are often the ones that attempt to push the envelope, that don't stay within the status quo. Though these people have historically been the more outspoken, the fringe, that try to push everyone away from what they currently are used to. Now that's not to say that conservatives aren't in favor of different ideologies, especially like this, but the very nature of being conservative is generally to preserve the status quo. Sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes it's not. It's an interesting discussion and one that should have been given more time, but sadly isn't. The next scene of note is when we come upon Sisko being stopped by two cops, portrayed by Dukat and Weyoun. He drops his picture of the space station for the story he was putting together, and the two police officers prevent him from picking it up. They ultimately will snatch it up, taking a look at it. The two white officers have a hard time believing that the black man is a writer, asking if he was a janitor or something. And after this, they continue to hassle him simply for his existence. When looking at this interaction, I do believe it's worth noting that Gul Dukat wants to take Sisko in while Weyoun just opts to let him go and gives a warning. This could probably speak to the mentality of the Cardassians wanting to punish him and the Dominion wanting people to go along their way as long as they bow to what the authority says. But then again, it's pretty unrealistic to see police officers giving a person of color a hard time, so I guess we'll never know if that was the allegory or not. Sisko is stopped by his father, who is portrayed as a Catholic priest telling him that his life would be arduous. This interaction doesn't feel like it fits all that well and is a part of the glue and duct tape I talk about trying to tie everything together. I won't spend a lot of time here because, again, doesn't make sense, at least to me. Sisko begins writing a story based on the space station art that I had discussed. His tale is about a black captain in charge of a space station. The next day, after finishing his story, he stops by a diner where he talks to his fiancée, who is excited about the fact she would be buying that establishment. Ultimately, she encourages him to stop being a writer, to work on the diner with her. This, again, is probably an overanalyzation, but I find it really intriguing that she wants him to go for the sure bet of the restaurant. Of course, being an artist, whether it's a writer or YouTube content creator, generally means you live on the lower end of the cash spectrum. So she may be pushing him away from destitution, but consider. The diner quite clearly caters to the main demographic of African Americans, whereas him wanting to be a writer is something that requires him to interact with others outside of his social standing, which means more heartache and chances of failure. We'll talk more about that after this. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. If you like these videos and want to ensure that I can continue to do them, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/lorereloaded. With as much of a hit advertising is taking these days, I really need about $1,000 from Patreon to ensure that I can continue to do this. If you hate Patreon, consider becoming a YouTube member by clicking the button below. If less than 1% of those who view my stuff monthly give $1, this goal would be more than taken care of. If you can't, please just continue to watch. I'm not saying give money if you don't have it. I appreciate the consideration either way. Now let's get back into it. It's a sad fact, but for Sisko and many people in the 50s and 60s that attempted to move past who they were and interact with those who didn't share their same skin color would have a lot less likelihood of success. In all actuality, the diner was definitively the better decision. Cassie also says that the diner is their future, if they wanted a future. It's also very disheartening when we learn that Sisko in this universe is a veteran who served for the United States military and yet wasn't good enough to have his picture taken when people wanted to see who the writers of the science fiction were. The story moves on to Worf coming in as a famous baseball player and being excessively thirsty for Cassie. This seems out of left field, and why he openly tries to get Cassie to cheat on Sisko, I'll never know. We do learn that he's a baseball player, but he still finds himself being oppressed. He's not able to move out of the lower end of town because he wouldn't be accepted, even though he was widely popular and as good as any other player in baseball. We also see that Jake is a thief and actually has dialogue that makes Star Trek Discovery look tame.
Today or 100 years from now, it don't make a bit of difference. As far as they're concerned, we'll always be niggas.
The rest of the scenes in the diner either reinforce the message or show Sisko going crazy, so I'm going to focus on other parts of the episode. We do see Jadzia being portrayed as a ditzy secretary, and I'm not sure what the writers are going for here, but anyway. Sisko presents his story to Odo and his peers, who really do like it. However, Odo states he can't publish it because no one would want to publish it or would do the work in getting it out to the mainstream, and it could even start a race riot. Race riots. Man, 90s writers were so off about the future. I mean, look at current year 2020. Am I right? Odo would of course be called out by Quark, who says that his boss is a coward for not allowing the story about a black captain to move forward, in which Odo would call Quark a communist. Yeah, I'm not touching that one. In fact, there is even lines about how Sisko should write like O'Brien does. O'Brien largely stays clear of all race issues, just keeping his head down. If ever there was a message for Star Trek channels, this is probably it. Because everyone knows ignoring a problem and not addressing it is the best way to fix things. Sisko ultimately isn't deterred by Odo. He continues to write 6 more stories about the captain, an entire novella. This angers Odo, of course, who tells him that none of it can be used. O'Brien suggests to make it a dream, a Negro convict or shoeshine boy who has no hope of getting out of his status, dreaming about a better place where he could be the captain of a starship. It's ironic, the message of the tale here is that the only way the masses accept a black man being in power if it comes from someone dreaming who is a lower status black man. Odo acquiesces and sends it in for print at 3 cents a word. I do want to take a moment to say that I think the character of Odo isn't a bad guy. I don't even think he's racist. He just wants to keep his head down and keep everything else moving. His actions really remind me of a saying: evil perseveres when good men do nothing. But I do think it's unfair to completely condemn him as well. I don't think there are many people today that wouldn't do what he does here. Imagine, for a moment, how better the world might be today if one of 3 officers had told the 4th to move his knee, or physically stopped him from harming someone else. And imagine if this entire organization had been reformed because the populace was tired of what they were doing. Everyone just sits back and let these things happen, begrudgingly. And because of that, those of whom agree that it's okay to happen, or indeed even endorse it, thrive. And nothing changes. And looking back at the plot, while celebrating about his story going into print, Sisko and his fiancée hears gunshots. Sisko rushes forward to find 2 police officers that have shot Jake, who was trying to break into a car. The police say that Jake had a crowbar and they felt that he was going to use it as a weapon. Sisko attacks them and the 2 detectives begin beating the ever-living hell out of him. They do this while black police officers look on, holding the crowd back. The shots of who is beating up Sisko would interchange between the 2 police officers and then Weyoun and Gul Dukat. It would take weeks for Sisko to heal, and he would ultimately make his way back to work to see his story printed. But not only would they not print his story in the end, They end up firing him, all because the protagonist was a black captain. Sisko, of course, would tell them that they can't fire him because he would quit, and this would be immediately before he has a psychotic break. Ultimately, Captain Sisko wakes up showing it was all a hallucination, though he does question whether the actual universe of Trek was happening or if it was all in Benny Russell's mind. Thank God that it was actually happening and not the fevered pitch dreams of the writer. By now, I'm certain many have clicked off of the video, with others probably commenting that I'm being political or I've gone SJW. But let me be succinct here. I do think that as bad as it is in 2020, it was probably worse in the 1950s and 60s. That we're nowhere near where we used to be, but I do think that there is still injustice, a lot of it. I still think that a systemic oppression exists and even outright bigotry. I also worry because I see there are some out there who want to stop the current oppression just so they can flip it around and begin oppressing the historic oppressors. I want to leave you with this thought. Recently, someone imbued upon me one of the most valuable insights that I've had in the past few years. No one has to be racist for a racist system to exist. If that system is already in place in one fashion or another, people just have to not question it, not see its failings. And these can be great people who love everyone, but they refuse to see the truth. Maybe that's happening, maybe it's not. It's just a thought. Don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next Lore Reloaded.